Do you feel a shiver up your spine from fear? Yes, it's another story from the Nightshade diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind. Amp up your imagination and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted.
Farewell to the Master by Harry Bates. From his perch high in the ladder above the museum floor, Cliff Sutherland studied carefully each line and shadow of the great robot, then turned and looked thoughtfully down at the rush of visitors come from all over the solar system to see Newt and the traveler for themselves and to hear once again their amazing tragic story. He himself had come to feel an almost proprietary interest in the exhibit, and with some reason. He had been the only freelance picture reporter on the Capitol grounds when the visitors from the unknown had arrived and had obtained the first professional shots of the ship. He had witnessed at close hand every event of the next mad few days. He had therefore photographed many times the 8-foot robot, the ship, and the beautiful slain ambassador, Klaatu, and his imposing tomb out in the center of the tidal basin. And such was the continuing news value of the event to the billions of persons throughout habitable space. He was there now once more to get still other shots, and if possible, a new angle. This time he was after a picture which showed Newt as weird and menacing. The shots he had taken the day before had not given quite the effect he wanted, and he hoped to get it today. But the light was not yet right, and he had to wait for the afternoon to wane a little. The last of the crowd admitted in the present group hurried in, exclaiming at the great pure green curves of the mysterious time-space traveler, then completely forgetting the ship at sight of the awesome figure and great head of the giant Newt. Hinged robots of crude, man-like appearances were familiar enough, but never had Earthlings' eyes lain on one like this. For Newt had almost exactly the shape of a man, a giant, but a man, with greenish metal for man's covering flesh and greenish metal for man's bulging muscles. Except for a loincloth, he was nude. He stood like the powerful god of the machine of some undreamed of scientific civilization, on his face a look of sullen brooding thought. Those who looked at him did not make jest or idle remarks, and those nearest him usually did not speak at all. His strange internally illuminated red eyes were so set that every observer felt they were fixed on himself alone, and he engendered a feeling that he might at any moment step forward in anger and perform unimaginable deeds. A slight rustling sound came from speakers hidden in the ceiling above, and at once the noises of the crowd lessened. The recorded lecture was about to be given. Cliff sighed. He knew the thing by heart, had even been present when the recording was made, and met the speaker, a young chap named Stillwell. Ladies and gentlemen, began a clear and well-modulated voice, but Cliff was no longer attending. The shadows in the hollows of Newt's face and figure were deeper. It was almost time for a shot. He picked up and examined the proofs of the pictures he had taken the day before, and compared them critically with the subject. As he looked, a wrinkle came to his brow. He had not noticed it before, but now suddenly he had the feeling that since yesterday something about Newt was changed. The pose before him was the identical one in the photograph. Every detail on comparison seemed the same, but nevertheless the feeling persisted. He took up his viewing glass and more carefully compared subject and photograph line by line, and then he saw that there was a difference. With sudden excitement, Cliff snapped 2 pictures at different exposures. He knew he should wait a little and take others, but he was so sure he had stumbled on an important mystery that he had to get going, and quickly folding his accessory equipment, he descended the ladder and made his way out. 20 minutes later, consumed with curiosity, he was developing the new shots in his hotel bedroom. What Cliff saw when he compared the negative taken yesterday and today caused his scalp to tingle. Here was a slant indeed, and apparently no one but he knew. Still, what he had discovered, though it would have made the front page of every paper in the solar system, was, after all, only a lead. The story, what really had happened, he knew no better than anyone else. It must be his job to find out. And that meant he would have to secrete himself in the building and stay there all night. That very night, there was still time for him to get back before closing. He would take a small, very fast infrared camera that could see in the dark, and he would get the real picture and the story. He snatched up the little camera, grabbed an air cab, and hurried back to the museum. The place was filled with another section of the ever-present queue, and the lecture was just ending. He thanked heaven that his arrangement with the museum permitted him to go in and out at will. He had already decided what to do. First, he made his way to the floating guard and asked a single question, and anticipation broadened on his face as he heard the expected answer. The second thing was to find a spot where he would be safe from the eyes of the men who would close the floor for the night. There was only one possible place, the laboratory set up behind the ship. Boldly, he showed his press credentials to the second guard, stationed at the partition passageway leading to it, stating that he had come to interview the scientist and in a moment was at the laboratory door. He had been there a number of times and knew the room well. It was a large area, roughly partitioned off for the work of the scientists engaged in breaking their way into the ship, and full of a confusion of massive and heavy objects, electric and hot hair ovens, carboys of chemicals, asbestos, sheeting compressors, basins, ladles, a microscope, and a great deal of smaller equipment common to a metallurgical laboratory. 3 white-smocked men were deeply engrossed in an experiment at the far end. Cliff, waiting a good moment, slipped inside and hid himself under a table half buried with supplies. He felt reasonably safe from detection there. Very soon now, the scientists would be going home for the night. From beyond the ship, he could hear another section of the waiting queue filing in, the last, he hoped, of the day. He settled himself as comfortably as he could. In a moment the lecture would begin. He had to smile when he thought of one thing the recording would say. Then there it was again, the clear, trained voice of the chap Stillwell. The foot scrapings and whispers of the crowd died away, and Cliff could hear every word, in spite of the great bulk of the ship lying interposed. "Ladies and gentlemen," began the familiar words, "the Smithsonian Institution welcomes you to its new interplanetary wing and to the marvelous exhibit at this moment before you." A slight pause. "All of you must know by now something of what happened here 3 months ago. If indeed you did not, see it for yourself from the telescreen," the voice went on. "The few facts are briefly told. A little after 5 p.m. on September the 16th, visitors to Washington thronged the grounds outside this building in their usual numbers and no doubt with their usual thoughts. The day was warm and fair. A stream of people was leaving the main entrance of the museum just outside in the direction you are facing. This wing, of course, was not here at that time. Everyone was homeward bound, tired no doubt from hours on their feet, seeing the exhibits of the museum and visiting the many buildings on the grounds nearby. And then it happened. On the area just to your right, just as it is now, appeared the time-space traveler. It appeared in the blink of an eye. It did not come down from the sky. Dozens of witnesses swear to that. It just appeared. One moment it was not here, the next it was. He appeared on the very spot it now rests on. The people nearest the ship were stricken with panic and ran back with cries and screams. Excitement spread out over Washington in a tidal wave. Radio, television, and newspaper men rushed here at once. Police formed a wide cordon around the ship, and army units appeared and trained guns and ray projectors on it. The direst calamity was feared, for it was recognized from the very beginning that this was no spaceship from anywhere in the solar system. Every child knew that only 2 spaceships had ever been built on Earth, and none at all on any of the other planets and satellites, and of those 2, One had been destroyed when it was pulled into the sun. The other had just been reported safely arrived on Mars. Then, the one made here had a shell of a strong aluminum alloy, while this one, as you see, is of an unknown greenish metal. The ship appeared and just sat there. No one emerged, and there was no sign that it contained life of any kind. That, as much as any single thing, caused excitement to skyrocket. Who or what was inside? Were the visitors hostile or friendly? Where did the ship come from? How did it arrive so suddenly right on this spot without dropping from the sky? For 2 days the ship rested here, just as you now see it, without motion or sign that it contained life. Long before the end of that time, the scientists had explained that it was not so much a spaceship as a space-time traveler, because only such a ship could arrive as this one did, materialize. They pointed out that such a traveler, while theoretically understandable to us Earthmen, was far beyond attempt at our present state of knowledge, and that this one, activated by relativity principles, might well have come from the far corner of the universe, from a distance which light itself would require millions of years to cross. When this opinion was disseminated, public tension grew until it was almost intolerable. Where had the traveler come from? Who were its occupants? Why had they come to Earth? Above all, why did they not show themselves? Were they perhaps preparing some terrible weapon of destruction? And there was the ship's entrance port. Men who dared go look reported that none could be found. No slightest break or crack marred the perfect smoothness of the ship's curving ovoid surface, and a delegation of high-ranking officials who visited the ship could not, by knocking, elicit from its occupant any sign that they had been heard. At last, after exactly 2 days in full view of tens of thousands of persons assembled and standing well back and under the muzzle of scores of the Army's most powerful guns and ray projectors, an opening appeared in the wall of the ship, and a ramp slid down, and out stepped a man, godlike in appearance and human in form, closely followed by a giant robot. And when they touched the ground, the ramp slid back and the entrance closed as before. It was immediately apparent to all the assembled thousands that the stranger was friendly. The first thing he did was to raise his right arm high in the universal gesture of peace, but it was not that which impressed those nearest so much as the expression on his face, which radiated kindness, wisdom, the purest nobility, and his delicately tinted robe. He looked like a benign god. At once, waiting for this appearance, a large committee of high-ranking government officials and army officers advanced to greet the visitor. With graciousness and dignity, the man pointed to himself, then to his robot companion, and said in perfect English with a peculiar accent, "I am Klaatu," or name that sounded like that, "and this is Nut." The names were not well understood at the time, but the sight and sound film of the television men caught them, and they became known to everyone subsequently. And then occurred the thing which shall always be to the shame of the human race. From a treetop 100 yards away came a wink of violet light, and Klaatu fell. The assembled multitude stood for a moment stunned, not comprehending what had happened. Newt, a little behind his master, and to one side, slowly turned his body a little toward him, moved his head twice, and stood still in exactly the position you now see him. Then followed pandemonium. The police pulled the slayer of Klaatu out of the tree. They found him mentally unbalanced. He kept crying that the devil had come to kill everyone on earth. He was taken away, and Klaatu, although obviously dead, was rushed to the nearest hospital to see if anything could be done to revive him. Confused and frightened crowds milled about the Capitol grounds the rest of the afternoon and much of that night. The ship remained as silent and motionless as before, and Newt too never moved from the position he had come to rest in. Newt never moved again. He remained exactly as you see him all that night and for the ensuing days. When the mausoleum in the basin was built, Klaatu's burial services took place where you are standing now, attended by the highest functionaries of all the great countries of the world. It was not only the most appropriate, but the safest thing to do, for if there should be other living creatures in the Traveler, as seemed possible at that time, they had to be impressed by the sincere sorrow of us Earthmen at what had happened. If Newt was still alive, or perhaps I had better say functionable, there was no sign. He stood as you see him during the entire ceremony. He stood so while his master was floated out to the mausoleum and given to the centuries with a tragically short sight and sound record of his historic visit. And he stood so afterward, day after day, night after night, in fair weather and in rain, never moving or showing by any slightest sign that he was aware of what had gone on. After the interment, this wing was built out from the museum to cover the Traveler and Newt. Nothing else could very well have been done. It was learned for both Newt and the ship were far too heavy to be moved safely by any means at hand. You have heard about the efforts of our metallurgists since then to break into the ship and of their complete failure. Behind the ship now, as you can see from either end, a partition workroom has been set up where the attempt still goes on. So far, its wonderful greenish metal has proved inviolable. Not only are they unable to get in, but they cannot even find the exact place from which Klaatu and Newt emerged. The chalk marks you see are the best approximation. Many people have feared that Newt was only temporarily deranged, and that on return to function might be dangerous, so the scientists have completely destroyed all chance of that. The greenish metal of which he is made seemed to be the same as that of the ship, and could no more be attacked. They found, nor could they find, any way to penetrate to his internals. But they had other means. They sent electrical currents of tremendous voltages and amperages through him. They applied terrific heat to all parts of his metal shell. They immersed him for days in gases and acids and strongly corroding solutions, and they bombarded him with every known kind of ray. You need have no fear of him now. He cannot possibly have retained the ability to function in any way. But a word of caution. The officials of the government know that visitors will not show any disrespect in this building. It may be that the unknown and unthinkably powerful civilization from which Klaatu and Newt came may send other emissaries to see what happened to them. Whether or not they do, not one of us must be found amiss in our attitude. None of us could very well anticipate what happened, and we are all immeasurably sorry. But we are still, in a sense, responsible, and must do what we can to avoid possible retaliations. You will be allowed to remain 5 minutes longer, and then, when the gong sounds, you will please leave promptly. The robot attendants along the wall will answer any questions you may have. Look well, for before you stand stark symbols of the achievement, mystery, and frailty of the human race. The recorded voice ceased speaking. Cliff, carefully moving his cramped limbs, broke out in a wide smile. If they knew what he knew. For his photograph told a slightly different story from that of the lecturer, and yesterday a line of the figured floor showed clearly at the outer edge of the robot's near foot, and today's that line was covered. Newt had moved. Or been moved? Though this was very unlikely. Where was the derrick and other evidence of such activity? It could hardly have been done in one night, and all signs so quickly concealed. And why should it be done at all? Still, to make sure, he had asked the guard. He could almost remember verbatim his answer. No, Newt has neither moved nor been moved since the death of his master. A special point was made of keeping him in the position he assumed at Klaatu's death. The floor was built in under him, and the scientists who completed his derangement erected their apparatus around him, just as he stands. You need have no fears. Cliff smiled again. He did not have any fears. Not yet. Part 2. A moment later, the big gong above the entrance doors rang the closing hour, and immediately following it a voice from the speakers called out, 5 o'clock, ladies and gentlemen. Closing time, ladies and gentlemen. The three scientists, as if surprised it was so late, hurriedly washed their hands, changed to their street clothes, and disappeared down the partition corridor, oblivious of the young picture man hidden under the table. The slide and scrape of the feet on the exhibition floor rapidly dwindled until at last there was only the step of the two guards, walking from one point to another, making sure everything was all right for the night. For just a moment one of them glanced in the doorway of the laboratory. Then he joined the other at the entrance. Then the great metal doors clanged to, and there was silence. Cliff waited several minutes, then carefully poked his way out from under the table. As he straightened up, a faint tinkling crash sounded at the floor at his feet. Carefully stooping, he found the shattered remains of a thin glass pipette. He had knocked it off the table. That caused him to realize something he had not thought of before. A newt who had moved might be a newt who could see and hear, and really be dangerous. He would have to be very careful. He looked about him. The room was bounded at the ends by two fiber partitions, which, at the inner ends, followed close under the curving bottom of the ship. The inner side of the room was the ship itself, and the outer was the southern wall of the wing. There were four large high windows. The only entrance was by way of the passage. Without moving from his knowledge of the building, he made his plan. The wing was connected with the western end of the museum by a doorway, never used, and extended westward toward the Washington Monument. The ship lay nearest the southern wall, and Newt stood out in front of it, not far from the northeast corner, and at the opposite end of the room from the entrance of the building and the passageway leading to the laboratory. By retracing his steps, he would come out on the floor at the point furthest removed from the robot. This was just what he wanted, for on the other side of the entrance, on a low platform, stood a paneled table containing the lecture apparatus, and this table was the only object in the room which afforded a place for him to lie concealed while waiting what might go on. The only other objects on the floor were the six man-like robot attendants in fixed stations along the northern wall, placed there to answer visitor questions. He would have to gain the table. He turned and began cautiously tiptoeing out of the laboratory and down the passageway. It was already dark there, and for what light still entered the exhibition hall was shut off by the great bulk of the ship. He reached the end of the room without making a sound. Very carefully he edged forward and peered around the bottom of the ship at Newt. He had a momentary shock. The robot's eyes were right on him, or so it seemed. Was that only the effect of the set of his eyes, he wondered? Or was he already discovered? The position of Newt's head did not seem to have changed, at any rate. Probably everything was all right, but he wished he did not have to cross the end of the room with the feeling that the robot's eyes were following him. He drew back and sat down and waited. It would have to be totally dark before he essayed the trip to the table. He waited a full hour, until the faint beams from the lamps on the grounds outside began to make the room seem to grow lighter. Then he got up and peeped around the ship once more. The robot's eyes seemed to pierce right at him, as before, only now, due no doubt to the darkness, the strange internal illumination seemed much brighter. This was a chilling thing. Did Newt know he was there? What were the thoughts of the robot? What could be the thoughts of a man-made machine, even so wonderful as one as Newt? It was time for the cross, so Cliff slung his camera around on his back, went down on his hands and knees, and carefully moved to the edge of the entrance wall. There he lifted himself as closely as he could into the angle made by it with the floor and started inching ahead. Never pausing, not risking a glance at Newt's unnerving red eyes, moving an inch at a time, he snaked along. He took 10 minutes to cover the space of 100 feet, and he was wet with perspiration when his fingers at last touched the 1-foot rise of the platform on which the table stood. Still, slowly, silently as a shadow, he made his way over the edge and melted behind the protection of the table. At last he was there. He relaxed for a moment, then, anxious to know whether he had been seen, carefully turned and looked around the side of the table. Newt's eyes were now full on him, or so it seemed. Against the general darkness the robot loomed, a mysterious and still darker shadow that, for all his being 150 feet away, seemed to dominate the room. Cliff could not tell whether the position of his body was changed or not. But if Newt were looking at him, he at least did nothing else. Not by the slightest motion that Cliff could discern did he appear to move. His position was the one he had maintained these last 3 months, in the darkness, in the rain, and this last week in the museum. Cliff made up his mind not to give way to fear. He became conscious of his own body. The cautious trip had taken something out of him. His knees and elbows burned, and his trousers were no doubt ruined. But these were little things if what he hoped for came to pass. If Newt so much as moved, and he could catch him with his infrared camera, he would have a story that would buy him 50 suits of clothes. And if on top of that he could learn the purpose of Newt's moving, provided there was a purpose, that would be a story that would set the world on its ears. He settled down to a period of waiting. There was no telling when Newt would move, if indeed he would move that night. Cliff's eyes had long been adjusted to the dark, and he could make out the larger objects well enough. From time to time he peered out at the robot, peered long and hard, till his outlines wavered, and he seemed to move, and he had to blink and rest his eyes to be sure it was only his imagination. Again the minute hand of his watch crept round the dial. The inactivity made Cliff careless, and for longer and longer periods he kept his head back out of sight behind the table. And so it was that when Newt did move, he was scared almost out of his wits. Dull and a little bored, he suddenly found the robot out on the floor, halfway in his direction. But that was not the most frightening thing. It was that when he did see Newt, he did not catch him moving. He was stopped as still as a cat in the middle of stalking a mouse. His eyes were now much brighter, and there was no remaining doubt about their direction. He was looking right at Cliff. Scarcely breathing, half hypnotized, Cliff looked back. His thoughts tumbled. What was the robot's intention? Why had he stopped so still? Was he being stalked? How could he move with such silence? In the heavy darkness, Newt's eyes moved nearer. Slowly but in perfect rhythm, the most imperceptible sound of his footsteps beat on Cliff's ears. Cliff, usually resourceful enough, was this time caught flat-footed. Frozen with fear, utterly incapable of fleeing, he lay where he was, while the metal monster with the fiery eyes came on. For a moment Cliff all but fainted, and when he recovered there was Newt, towering over him, legs almost within reach. He was bending slightly, burning his terrible eyes right into his own. Too late to try to think of running now. Trembling like any cornered mouse, Cliff waited for the blow that would crush him. For an eternity, it seemed, Newt scrutinized them without moving. For each second of that eternity, Cliff expected annihilation, sudden, quick, complete. And then suddenly and unexpectedly it was over. Newt's body straightened and he stepped back. He turned, and then, with the almost jerkless rhythm which only he among robots possess, he started back towards the place from which he came. Cliff could hardly believe he had been spared. Newt could have crushed him like a worm, and he had only turned around and gone back. Why? It could not be supposed that a robot was capable of human considerations. Newt went straight to the other end of the traveler. At a certain place he stopped and made a curious succession of sounds. At once Cliff saw an opening, blacker than the gloom of the building, appear in the ship's side, and it was followed by a slight sliding sound as a ramp slid out and met the floor. Newt walked up the ramp and, stooping a little, disappeared inside the ship. Then for the first time Cliff remembered the picture he had come to get. Newt had moved, but he had not caught him. But at least now, whatever opportunities there might be later, he could get the shot of the ramp connecting with the open door. So he twisted his camera into position, set it for the proper exposure, and took a shot. A long time passed, and Newt did not come out. What could he be doing inside, Cliff wondered. Some of his courage returned to him, and he toyed with the idea of creeping forward and peeping through the port, but he found he had not the courage for that. Newt had spared him, at least for the time, but there was no telling how far his tolerance would go. An hour passed, then another. Newt was doing something inside the ship, but what Cliff could not imagine. If the robot had been a human being, he knew he would have sneaked a look. But as it was, he was too much of an unknown quantity. Even the simplest of Earth's robots, under certain circumstances, were inexplicable things. What then of this one? Come from an unknown and even unthinkable civilization. By far the most wonderful construction ever seen. What superhuman powers might he not possess? All that the scientists of Earth could do had not served to derange him. Acid, heat, rays, terrific crushing blows. He had withstood them all. Even his finish had been unmarred. He might be able to see perfectly in the dark. And right where he was, he might be able to hear, or in some way sense the least change in Cliff's position. More time passed, and then sometime after 2 o'clock in the morning, a simple homely thing happened. But a thing so unexpected that for a moment it quite destroyed Cliff's equilibrium. Suddenly through the dark and silent building, there was a faint whir of wings, soon followed by the piercing sweet voice of a bird. A mockingbird. Somewhere in the gloom above his head, clear and full-throated were its notes, a dozen little songs it sang, one after the other without pause between, short, insistent calls, twirrings, coaxings, cooings, the spring love songs of perhaps the finest singer in the world. Then as suddenly as it began, the voice was silent. If an invading army had poured out of the traveler, Cliff would have been less surprised. The month was December. Even in Florida, the mockingbirds had not yet begun their song. How had one gotten into that tight, gloomy museum? How and why was it singing there? He waited, full of curiosity. Then suddenly he was aware of Newt standing just outside the port of the ship. He stood quite still, his glowing eyes turned squarely in Cliff's direction. For a moment the hush in the museum seemed to deepen. Then it was broken by a soft thud on the floor near where Cliff was lying. He wondered. The light in Newt's eyes changed, and he started his almost jerkless walk in Cliff's direction. When only a little away, the robot stopped, bent over, and picked something from the floor. For some time he stood without motion and looked at a little object he held in his hand. Cliff knew, though he could not see it, that it was the mockingbird. Its body, for he was sure that it had lost its song forever. Newt then turned, and without a glance at Cliff, walked back to the ship and again went inside. Hours passed while Cliff waited for some sequel to this surprising happening. Perhaps it was because of his curiosity that his fear of the robot began to lessen. Surely, if the mechanism was unfriendly, if he intended him any harm, he would have finished him before, when he had such a perfect opportunity. Cliff began to nerve himself for a quick look into the port, and a picture. He must remember the picture. He kept forgetting the very reason he was there. It was in the deeper darkness of the false dawn when he got sufficient courage and made the start. He took off his shoes, and in his stocking feet, his shoes tied together and slung over his shoulder, he moved stiffly but rapidly to a position behind the nearest of the 6 robot attendants stationed along the wall, then paused for some sign which might indicate that Newt knew he had moved. Hearing none, he slipped along behind the next robot attendant and paused again. Bolder now, he made in one spurt all the distance to the furthest one of the 6, fixed just opposite the port of the ship. There he met with a disappointment. No light that he could detect was visible within. There was only darkness and the all-permeating silence. Still, he had better get the picture. He raised his camera, focused it on the dark opening, and gave the film a comparatively long exposure. Then he stood there, at a loss what to do next. As he paused, a peculiar series of muffled noises reached his ears, apparently from within the ship. Animal noises, first scrapings and pantings, punctuated by several sharp clicks, then deep rough snarls, interrupted by more scrapings and pantings as if a struggle of some kind were going on. Then suddenly, before Cliff could even decide to run back to the table, A low, wide, dark shape bounded out of the port and immediately turned and grew to the height of a man. A terrible fear swept over Cliff even before he knew what the shape was. And the next second Newt appeared in the port and stepped unhesitatingly down the ramp towards the shape. As he advanced, it backed slowly away for a few feet, but then it stood its ground. Its thick arms rose from its side and began a loud drumming on its chest, while from its throat came a deep roar of defiance. Only one creature in the world beat its chest and made a sound like that. The shape was a gorilla, and a huge one. Newt kept advancing, and when close, charged forward and grappled with the beast. Cliff would not have guessed that Newt could move so fast. In the darkness, he could not see the details of what happened. All he knew was that the two great shapes, the titanic metal Newt and the squat but terrifically strong gorilla, merged for a moment with silence on the robot's part and terrible, deep, indescribable roars on the others. Then the two separated, and it was as if the gorilla had been flung back and away. The animal at once rose to its full height and roared deafeningly. Newt advanced. They closed again, and the separation of before was repeated. The robot continued inexorably, and now the gorilla began to fall back down the building. Suddenly the beast darted at a man-like shape against the wall, and with one rapid side movement dashed the fifth robot attendant to the floor and decapitated it. Tense with fear, Cliff crouched behind his own robot attendant. He thanked heaven that Newt was between him and the gorilla and was continuing his advance. The gorilla back further, darted suddenly at the next robot in the row, and with strength almost unbelievable picked it up from its root and hurled it at Newt. With a sharp metallic bang, robot hit robot, and the one of Earth bounced off to one side and rolled to a stop. Cliff cursed himself for it afterward, but again he completely forgot the picture. The gorilla kept falling back down the building, demolishing with terrific bursts of rage every robot attendant that he passed, and throwing the pieces at the implacable Newt. Soon they arrived opposite the table, and Cliff now thanked his stars he had come away. Then followed a brief silence. Cliff could not make out what was going on, but he imagined that the gorilla had at last reached the corner of the wing and was trapped. If he was, it was only for a moment. The silence was suddenly shattered by a terrific roar, and the thick, squat shape of the animal came bounding toward Cliff. He came all the way back and turned just between Cliff and the port of the ship. Cliff prayed frantically for Newt to come back quickly. There was now the last remaining robot attendant between him and the madly dangerous brute. Out of the dimness, Newt did appear. The gorilla rose to its full height and again beat its chest and roared its challenge. And then occurred a curious thing. It fell to all fours and slowly rolled over on its side, as if weak or hurt. Then panting, making frightening noises, it forced itself again to its feet and faced the oncoming Newt. As it waited, its eyes was caught by the last robot attendant, and perhaps Cliff shrunk close behind it. With a surge of terrible destructive rage, the gorilla waddled sideways towards Cliff, but this time, even through his panic, he saw that the animal moved with difficulty, again apparently sick or severely wounded. He jumped back just in time. The gorilla put out the last robot attendant and hurled it violently at Newt, missing him narrowly. That was its last effort. The weakness caught it again. It dropped heavily on one side, rocked back and forth a few times, and fell to twitching. Then it lay still and did not move again. The first pale light of the dawn was seeping into the room. From the corner where he had taken refuge, Cliff watched closely the great robot. It seemed to him that he behaved very queerly. He stood over the dead gorilla, looking down at him with what in a human would be called sadness. Cliff saw this clearly. Newt's heavy greenish features bore a thoughtful, grieving expression new to his experience. For some moments he stood so, then as might a father with his sick child, he leaned over, lifted the great animal in his metal arms, and carried it tenderly within the ship. Cliff flew back to the table, suddenly fearful of yet another dangerous and inexplicable happening. It struck him that he might be safer in the laboratory, and with trembling knees he made his way there and hid in one of the big ovens. He prayed for full daylight. His thoughts were chaos. Rapidly, one after another, his mind churned up the amazing events of the night, but all was mystery. It seemed there would be no rational explanation for them. That mockingbird, the gorilla, Newt's sad expression, and his tenderness. What could account for a fantastic melange like that? Gradually full daylight did come. A long time passed. At last he began to believe he might yet get out of that place of mystery and danger alive. At 8:30 there were noises at the entrance, and the good sound of human voices came to his ears. He stepped out of the oven and tiptoed to the passageway. The noises stopped suddenly, and there was a frightened exclamation, and then the sound of running feet, and then silence. Stealthily, Cliff sneaked down the narrow way and peeped fearfully around the ship. There Newt was in his accustomed place, in the identical pose he had taken at the death of his master, brooding sullenly and alone over a space traveler, once again closed tight in a room that was in shambles. The entrance doors stood open, and heart in his mouth, Cliff ran out. A few minutes later, safe in his hotel room, completely done in, he sat down for a second and almost at once fell asleep. Later, still in his clothes and still asleep, he staggered over to the bed. He did not wake up till mid-afternoon. Part 3. Cliff awoke slowly, at first not realizing that the images tumbling in his head were real memories and not a fantastic dream. It was recollection of the pictures which brought him to his feet. Hastily he set about developing the film in his camera. Then in his hands was proof that the events of the night were real. Both shots turned out well. The first showed clearly the ramp leading up to the port as he had dimly discerned it from his position behind the table. The second, of the open port as snapped from in front, was a disappointment, for a blank wall just back at the opening cut off all view of the interior. That would account for the fact that no light had escaped from the ship while Newt was inside, assuming Newt required light for whatever he did. Cliff looked at the negatives and was ashamed of himself. What a rotten picture man he was to come back with two ridiculous shots like these. He had a score of opportunities to get real ones. Shots of Newt in action, Newt's fight with the gorilla, even Newt holding the mockingbird. Spine-chilling stuff, and all he had brought back was two stills of a doorway. Oh, sure, they were valuable, but he was a grade A ass. And to top this brilliant performance, he had fallen asleep. Well, he'd better get out on the street and find out what was doing. Quickly he showered, shaved, and changed his clothes, and soon was entering a nearby restaurant, patronized by other picture and newsmen. Sitting alone at the lunch bar, he spotted a friend and competitor. "Well, what do you think?" asked his friend when he took the stool at his side. "I don't think anything until I've had breakfast," Cliff answered. "Then haven't you heard?" "Heard what?" offended Cliff, for he knew very well what was coming. "You're a fine picture man," was the other's remark. "When something really big happens, you're asleep in bed." But then he told him what had been discovered that morning in the museum, and of the worldwide excitement at the news. Cliff did three things at once. Successfully gobbled a substantial breakfast, kept thanking his stars that nothing new had transpired, and showed continuous surprise. Still chewing, he got up and hurried over to the building. Outside, bulked at the door, was a large crowd of the curious, but Cliff had no trouble gaining admittance when he showed his press credentials. Newt and the ship stood just as he had left them, but the floor had been cleaned up, and the pieces of the demolished robot attendants were lined up in one place along the wall. Several other competitor friends of his were there. "I was away, missed the whole thing," he said to one of them, Gus. "What's supposed to be the explanation for what happened?" "Ask something easy," was the answer. "Nobody knows. It stopped. Maybe something came out of the ship. Maybe another robot like Newt. Say, where have you been?" "Asleep." "Better catch up. Several billion bipeds are scared stiff. Revenge for the death of Klaatu. Earth about to be invaded." "But that's... Oh, I know it's all crazy. But that's the story they're being fed. It sells news. But there's a new angle just turned up. Very surprising. Come here." He led Cliff to the table where stood a knot of people, looking with great interest at several objects started by a technician. Gus pointed to a long slide on which were mounted a number of short, dark brown hairs. Those hairs came off a large male gorilla, Gus said with a certain hard-boiled casualness. Most of them were found among the sweepings of the floor this morning. The rest were found the robot attendants. Cliff tried to look astounded. Gus pointed to a test tube partly filled with a light amber fluid. And that's blood, diluted, gorilla blood, was found on Newt's arms. Good heavens, Cliff managed to exclaim. And there's no explanation? Not even a theory. It's your big chance, Wonder Boy. Cliff broke away from Gus, unable to maintain his act any longer. He couldn't decide what to do about this story. The press services would bid heavily for it with all his pictures, but that would take further action out of his hands. In the back of his mind, he wanted to stay in the wing again that night, but, well, he simply was afraid. He'd had a pretty stiff dose, and he wanted very much to remain alive. He walked over and looked a long time at Newt. No one would ever have guessed that he had moved, or that there had rested on his greenish metal face a look of sadness. Those weird eyes. Cliff wondered if they were really looking at him, as they seemed recognizing him as the bold intruder of last night. Of what unknown stuff were they made? Those materials placed in his eye sockets by one branch of the race of man, which all the science of his own could not even serve to dysfunction. What was Newt thinking? What could he be the thoughts of a robot, a mechanism of metal poured out of man's clay crucibles? Was he angry at him? Cliff thought not. Newt had had him at his mercy, and had walked away. Dared he stay again? Cliff thought perhaps he did. He walked about the room, thinking it over. He felt sure Newt would move again. A Migton ray gun would protect him from another gorilla, or 50 of them. He did not yet have the real story. He had come back with 2 miserable architectural stills. He might have known from the first that he would stay. At dusk that night, armed with his camera and a small Migton gun, he lay once more under the table of supplies in the laboratory and heard the metal doors of the wing clang to for the night. This time he would get the story and the pictures, if only no guard was posted inside. Part 4. Cliff listened hard for a long time for any sound which might tell him that a guard had been left, but the silence within the wing remained unbroken. He was thankful for that, but not quite completely. The gathering darkness and the realization that he was not irrevocably committed made the thought of a companion not altogether unpleasant. About an hour after it reached maximum darkness, he took off his shoes, tied them together and slung them around his neck, down his back, and stole quietly down the passageway to where it opened into the exhibition area. All seemed as it had been the preceding night. Newt loomed an ominous, indistinct shadow at the far end of the room, his glowing red eyes again seemingly right on the spot from which Cliff peeped out. As on the previous night, but even more carefully, Cliff went down on his stomach in the angle of the wall and slowly snaked across to the low platform on which stood the table. Once in its shelter, he fixed his shoes so that they straddled one shoulder and brought his camera and gun holster around, ready on his breast. This time, he told himself, he would get pictures. He settled himself down to wait, keeping Newt in full sight every minute. His vision reached maximum adjustment to the darkness. Eventually, he began to feel lonely and a little afraid. Newt's red glowing eyes were getting on his nerves. He had to keep assuring himself that the robot would not harm him. He had little doubt but that he himself was being watched. Hours slowly passed. From time to time he heard slight noises at the entrance on the outside. A guard, perhaps, or maybe curious visitors. At about 9 o'clock, he saw Newt move. First, his head alone had turned so that the eyes burned stronger in the direction where Cliff lay. For a moment that was all. Then the dark metal form stirred slightly and began moving forward, straight towards himself. Cliff had thought he would not be afraid much, but now his heart stood still. What would happen this time? With amazing silence, Newt drew nearer until he towered an ominous shadow over the spot where Cliff lay. For a long time his red eyes burned down on the prone man. Cliff trembled all over. This was worse than the first time. Without having planned it, he found himself speaking to the creature. "You would not hurt me," he pleaded. "I was only curious to see what's going on. It's my job. Can you understand me? I would not harm or bother you. I couldn't if I wanted to. Please." The robot never moved, and Cliff could not guess whether his words had been understood or even heard. When he felt he could not bear the suspense any longer, Newt reached out and took something from a drawer of the table, or perhaps he put something back in. Then he stepped back, turned, and retraced his steps. Cliff was safe. Again, the robot had spared him. Beginning then, Cliff lost much of his fear. He felt sure now that this Newt would do him no harm. Twice he had had him in his power, and each time he had only looked and quietly moved away. Cliff could not imagine what Newt had done in the drawer of the table. He watched with the greatest curiosity to see what would happen next. As on the night before, the robot went straight to the end of the ship and made the peculiar sequence of sounds that opened the port, and when the ramp slid out he went inside. After that, Cliff was alone in the darkness for a very long time, probably 2 hours. Not a sound came from the ship. Cliff knew he should sneak up to the port and peep inside, but he could not quite bring himself to do it. With his gun he could handle another gorilla, but if Newt caught him, it might be the end. Momentarily he expected something fantastic to happen. He knew not what. Maybe the mockingbird's sweet song again? Maybe a gorilla? Maybe anything? What did at last happen once more caught him with complete surprise. He heard a sudden slight muffled sound, then words. Human words. Everyone familiar. "Gentlemen," was the first, and then there was a very slight pause. "The Smithsonian Institution welcomes you to its new interplanetary wing, and to the marvelous exhibits at this moment before you." It was a recorded voice of Stillwell, but it was not coming through the speakers overhead, but much muted from within the ship. After a slight pause it went on. "All of you must," here it stammered and came to a stop. Cliff's hair bristled. That stammering was not in the lecture. For just a moment there was silence. Then came a scream, a hoarse man's scream, muffled from somewhere within the heart of the ship. It was followed by muted gasps and cries, as of a man in great fright or distress. Every nerve tight, Cliff watched the port. He heard a thudding noise within the ship, then out the door flew the shadow of what was surely a human being. Gasping and half stumbling, he ran straight down the room in Cliff's direction. When 20 feet away, the great shadow of Newt followed him out of the port. Cliff watched breathless. The man, it was Stillwell, he saw now, came straight for the table behind which Cliff himself lay, as if to get behind it. But when only a few feet away, his knees buckled and he fell to the floor. Suddenly Newt was standing over him, but Stillwell did not seem to be aware of it. He appeared very ill, but kept making spasmodic, futile efforts to creep onto the protection of the table. Newt did not move, so Cliff was emboldened to speak. "What's the matter, Stillwell?" he asked. "Can I help? Don't be afraid. I'm Cliff Sutherland, you know, the picture man." Without showing the least surprise at finding Cliff there and clutching at his presence like a drowning man with a straw, Stillwell gasped out, "Help me! Newt!" He seemed unable to go on. "Newt what?" asked Cliff, very conscious of the fire-eyed robot looming over and above them, and afraid even to move on to the man. Cliff added reassuringly, "Newt won't hurt you. I'm sure he won't. He doesn't hurt me. What's the matter? What can I do?" With a sudden accession of energy, Stillwell rose on his elbow. "Where am I?" he asked. "In the interplanetary wing," Cliff answered. "Don't you know?" Only Stillwell's hard breathing was heard for a moment. Then hoarsely, weakly asked, "How did I get here?" "I don't know," said Cliff. "I was making a lecture recording," Stillwell said, "when suddenly I found myself here. Or I mean, in there." He broke off and showed a return of his terror. "Then what?" asked Cliff gently. "I was in that box, and there above me was Newt, the robot. Newt." But they made Newt harmless. He's never moved. Steady now, said Cliff. I don't think Newt will hurt you. Stillwell fell back on the floor. I'm very weak, he gasped. Something. Will you get a doctor? He was utterly unaware that towering above him, eyes boring down at him through the darkness, was the robot he feared so greatly. As Cliff hesitated at a loss what to do, the man's breath began coming in short gasps, as regular as the ticking of a clock. Cliff dared to move out to him, but no act on his part could have helped the man now. His gasps weakened and became spasmodic, then suddenly he was completely silent and still. Cliff felt for his heart, then looked up to the eyes and the shadow above. He's dead, he whispered. The robot seemed to understand, or at least to hear. He bent forward and regarded the still figure. What is it, Newt? Cliff asked the robot suddenly. What are you doing? Can I help you in any way? Somehow I don't believe you are unfriendly, and I don't believe you killed this man. But what happened? Can you understand me? Can you speak? What is it you're trying to do? Newt made no sound or motion, but only looked at the still figure at his feet. In the robot's face, now so close, Cliff saw the look of sad contemplation. Newt stood so several minutes that he bent over, took the limp form carefully, even gently, Cliff thought, in his mighty arms, and carried him to the place along the wall where lay the dismembered pieces of the robot attendants. Carefully he laid him by their side. Then he went back into the ship. Without fear now, Cliff stole along the wall of the room. He had gotten almost as far as a shattered figure on the floor when he suddenly stopped motionless. Newt was emerging again. He was bearing a shape that looked like another body, a larger one. He held it in one arm and placed it carefully by the body of Stillwell. In the hand of his other arm, he held something that Cliff could not make out, and this he placed at the side of the body he had just put down. Then he went to the ship and returned once more with the shape, which he laid gently by the others. And when this last trip was over, he looked down at them all for a moment, then turned slowly back to the ship and stood motionless, as if in deep thought by the ramp. Cliff restrained his curiosity as long as he could, then slipped forward and bent over the objects Newt had placed there. First in the row was the body of Stillwell, as he expected, and the next was the great shapeless furry mass of a dead gorilla, the one of last night. By the gorilla lay the object the robot had carried in his free hand, the little body of the mockingbird. These last two had remained in the ship all night, and Newt, for all his surprising gentleness in handling them, was only cleaning house. But there was a fourth body whose history he did not know. He moved closer and bent very low to look. What he saw made him catch his breath. Impossible, he thought. There was some confusion in his directions. He brought his face back close to the first body. Then his blood ran cold. The first body was that of Stillwell, but the last in the row was Stillwell, too. There were two bodies of Stillwell, both exactly alike, both dead. Cliff backed away with a cry, and then panic took him and he ran down the room away from Newt and yelled and beat wildly on the door. There was a noise on the outside. "Let me out!" he yelled in terror. "Let me out! Let me out! Hurry!" A crack opened between the two doors, and he forced his way through like a wild animal and ran far out on the lawn. A belated couple on a nearby path stared at him with amazement, and this brought some sense to his head, and he slowed down and came to a stop. Back at the building, everything looked as usual, and in spite of his terror, Newt was not chasing him. He was still in his stocking feet. Breathing heavily, he sat down on the wet grass and put on his shoes. Then he stood and looked at the building, trying to pull himself together. What an incredible melange. The dead Stillwell, the dead gorilla, and the dead mockingbird, all dying before his eyes. And then that last frightening thing, the second dead Stillwell, whom he had not seen die, in Newt's strange gentleness and the sad expression he had twice seen on his face. As he looked, the grounds about the building came to life. Several people collected at the door of the wing. Above sounded the siren of a police copter, then, in the distance, another, and from all sides people came running. A few at first, then more and more. The police planes landed on the lawn just outside the door of the wing, and he thought he could see the officers peeping inside. Then suddenly the lights of the wing flooded on. In control of himself now, Cliff went back. He entered. He had left Newt standing in thought at the side of the ramp, but now he was again in his old familiar pose in the usual place, as if he had never moved. The ship's door was closed and the ramp gone, but the bodies, the four strangely assorted bodies, were still lying by the demolished robot attendants where he had left them in the dark. He was startled by a cry behind his back. A uniformed museum guard was pointing at him. "This is the man!" the guard shouted. "When I opened the door, this man forced his way out and ran like the devil." The police officers converged on Cliff. "Who are you? What is all this?" one of them asked him roughly. "I'm Cliff Sutherland, picture reporter," Cliff answered calmly, "and I was the one who was inside here and ran away, as the guard says." "What were you doing?" the officer asked, eyeing him. "And where did these bodies come from?" "Gentlemen, I'll tell you gladly. Only business first," Cliff answered. "There's been some fantastic goings-on in this room, and I saw them and have the story, but," he smiled, "I must decline to answer without advice of counsel until I've sold my story to one of the news syndicates. You know how it is. If you'll allow me the use of the radio in your plane, just for a moment, gentlemen, you'll have the whole story right afterward. Say in half an hour, when the television men broadcast it. Meanwhile, believe me, there's nothing for you to do, and there'll be no loss by the delay." The officer who had asked the question blinked, and one of the others, quicker to react and certainly not a gentleman, stepped toward Cliff with clenched fist. Cliff disarmed him by handing him his press credentials. He glanced at them rapidly and put them in his pocket. By now, 100 people were there, and among them were two members of a syndicate crew whom he knew arrived by copter. The police growled, but they let him whisper in their ear and then go out under escort to the crew's plane. There by radio in 5 minutes, Cliff made a deal which would bring him more money than he had ever before earned in a year. After that, he turned over all his pictures and negatives to the crew and gave them the story, and they lost not 1 second in spinning back to their offices with a flash. More and more people arrived, and the police cleared the building. 10 minutes later, a big crew of radio and television men forced their way in, sent there by the syndicate with which he had dealt, and then a few minutes later, under the glaring light set up by the operators and standing close by the ship and not far from Newt, he refused to stand underneath him, Cliff gave his story to the cameras and microphones, which in a fraction of a second shot it to every corner of the solar system. Immediately afterward, the police took him to jail, on general principles and because they were pretty blooming mad. Part 5. Cliff stayed in jail all that night until 8 o'clock the next morning, when the syndicate finally succeeded in digging up a lawyer and got him out. And then, when at last he was leaving, a federal man caught him by the wrist. "You're wanted for further questioning over at the Continental Bureau of Investigation," the agent told him. Cliff went along willingly. Fully 35 high-ranking federal officers and big names were waiting for him in an imposing conference room. One of the president's secretaries, the undersecretary of state, the underminister of defense, scientists, a colonel, executives, department heads, and ranking seamen, all grade mustache Sanders, chief of the CBI, was presiding. They made him tell the story all over again, and then in parts all over once more, not because they did not believe him, but because they kept hoping to elicit some fact which would cast significant light on the mystery of Newt's behavior and the happenings of the last 3 nights. Patiently, Cliff racked his brains for every detail. Chief Sanders asked most of the questions. After more than an hour, when Cliff thought they had finished, Sanders asked him several more, all involving his personal opinions of what had transpired. "Do you think Newt was deranged in any way by the acids, rays, heat, and so forth applied to him by the scientist?" "I saw no evidence of it." "Do you think he can see?" "I'm sure he can see, or else has other powers which are equivalent." "Do you think he can hear?" "Yes, sir. That time when I whispered to him that Stillwell was dead, he bent over as if to see for himself. I would not be surprised if he also understood what I said. At no time did he speak except those sounds he made to open the ship. Not one word in English or any other language. Not one sound with his mouth. In your opinion, has his strength been impaired in any way by our treatment? Asked one of the scientists. I have told you how easily he handled the gorilla. He attacked the animal and threw it back, after which it retreated all the way down the building, afraid of him. How would you explain the fact that our autopsies disclosed no mortal wound, no cause of death in any way of the bodies, gorilla, mockingbird, or the two identical Stillwells? This from a medical officer. I can't. You think Newt is dangerous? From Sanders. Potentially very dangerous. Yet you say you have the feeling he is not hostile. To me, I meant, I do have that feeling, and I'm afraid I can't give any good reason for it except the way he spared me twice when he had me in his power. I think maybe the gentle way he handled the bodies had something to do with it, and maybe the sad, thoughtful look I twice caught on his face. Would you risk staying in the building alone another night? Not for anything. There were smiles. Did you get any pictures of what happened last night? No, sir, Cliff said with an effort to hold on to his composure, but he was swept by way of shame. A man hitherto silent rescued him by saying, a while ago you used the word purposive in connection with Newt's actions. Can you explain that a little? Yes, that was one of the things that struck me. Newt never seems to waste emotion. He can move with surprising speed when he wants to. I think that when he attacked the gorilla, but other times he walks around as if methodically completing some simple task, and that reminds me of a peculiar thing. At times, he gets into one position, any position, maybe half bent over and stays there for minutes at a time. It's as if his scale of time values was eccentric compared to ours. Something he does surprisingly fast and others surprisingly slow. This might account for his long periods of immobility. It's very interesting, said one of the scientists. How would you account for the fact that he recently moves only at night? I think he's doing something he wants no one to see, and the night is the only time he is alone. But he went ahead even after finding you there. I know, but I have no other explanation, unless he considered me harmless or unable to stop him, which was certainly the case. Before you arrived, we were considering encasing him in a large block of glass text. Do you think he would permit it? I don't know. Probably he would. He stood for the acids and rays and heat, but it had better be done in the daytime. Night seems to be the time he moves. But he moved in the daytime when he emerged from the traveler with Klaatu. I know. That seemed to be all they could think of to ask him. Sanders slapped his hand on the table. Well, I guess that's all, Mr. Sutherland, he said. Thank you for your help, and let me congratulate you for a very foolish, stubborn, brave young businessman, he smiled very faintly. You're free to go now, but it may be that I'll have to call you back later. We'll see. May I remain a while you decide about that glass text? Cliff asked. As long as I'm here, I'd like to have the tip. The decision has already been made. The tip's yours. The pouring will be started at once. Thank you, sir, said Cliff, and callously asked more. And will you be so kind as to authorize me to be present outside the building tonight? Just outside. I have a feeling something's going to happen. You want still another scoop, I see, said Sanders, not unkindly. Then you'll let the police wait a while you transact your business. Not again, sir. If anything happens, they'll get it at once. The chief hesitated. I don't know, he said. I'll tell you what. All the news services will want men there, and we can't have that. But if you can arrange to represent them all yourself, it's a go. Nothing's going to happen, but your reports will help calm the hysterical ones. Let me know. Cliff thanked him and hurried out, and phoned a syndicate the tip, free, then told them Sanders' proposal. 10 minutes later they called him back, said all was arranged, and told him to catch some sleep. They would cover the pouring. With light heart, Cliff hurried over to the museum. The place was surrounded by thousands of the curious, held far back by a strong cordon of police. For once he could not get through. He was recognized, and the police were still sore, but he did not care much. He suddenly felt very tired and needed that nap. He went back to his hotel, left a call, and went to bed. He had been asleep only a few minutes when his phone rang. Eyes shut, he answered it. It was one of the boys at the syndicate, with peculiar news. Still had just reported very much alive. The real Stillwell. The two dead ones were some kind of copies. He couldn't imagine how to explain them. He had no brothers. For a moment, Cliff came fully awake and then he went back to bed. Nothing was fantastic anymore. Part 6. At 4 o'clock, much refreshed, and with an infrared viewing magnifier slung over his shoulder, Cliff passed through the cordon and entered the door of the wing. He had been expected, and there was no trouble. As his eyes fell on Newt, an odd feeling went through him, and for some obscure reason he was almost sorry for the giant robot. Newt stood exactly as he had always stood, the right foot advanced a little, and the same brooding expression on his face. But now there was something more. He was solidly encased in a huge block of transparent glass text. From the floor on which he stood to the top of his full 8 feet, and from there on up for an equal distance, and for about 8 feet to the left, right, back, and front, he was immured in a water-clear prison which confined every inch of his surface and would prevent the slightest twitch of even his amazing muscles. It was absurd, no doubt, to feel sorry for a robot, a man-made mechanism, but Cliff had come to think of him as being really alive, as a human is alive. He showed purpose and will. He performed complicated and resourceful acts. His face had twice appeared to show the emotion of sadness, and several times what appeared to be deep thought. He had been ruthless with a gorilla and gentle with a mockingbird and the other two bodies, and he had twice refrained from crushing Cliff when there seemed every reason that he might. Cliff did not doubt for a minute that he was still alive, whatever that alive might mean. But outside were waiting the radio and television men. He had work to do. He turned and went to them, and all got busy. An hour later, Cliff sat alone, about 15 feet above the ground, in a big tree, which, located just across the walk from the building, commanded through a window a clear view of the upper part of Newt's body. Strapped to the limbs about him were 3 instruments: his infrared viewing magnifier, a radio mic, and an infrared television eye with sound pickup. The first, the viewing magnifier, would allow him to see in the dark with his own eyes, as if by daylight, a magnified image of the robot, and the others would pick up any sights and sounds, including his own remarks, and transmit them to the several broadcast studios, which would fling them millions of miles in all directions through space. Never before had a picture man had such an important assignment. Probably, certainly not one who forgot to take pictures. But now that was forgotten, and Cliff was quite proud and ready. Far back in a great circle stood a multitude of the curious and the fearful. Would the plastic glass text hold Newt? If it did not, would he come out thirsting for revenge? Would unimaginable things come out of the traveler and release him, and perhaps exact revenge? Millions at the receivers were jittery. Those in the distance hoped nothing awful would happen, yet they hoped something would, and they were prepared to run. In carefully selected spots not far from Cliff, on all sides were mobile ray batteries manned by army units, and in a hollow in back of him, while to his right, there was stationed a huge tank with a large gun. Every weapon was trained on the door of the wing. A row of smaller, faster tanks stood ready 50 yards directly north. Their ray projectors were aimed at the door, but not their guns. The grounds about the building contained only one spot, the hollow where the great tank was, where, by close calculation, a shell directed at the doorway would not cause damage and loss of life to some part of the sprawling capital. Dusk fell. Outstreamed the last of the army officers, politicians, and other privileged ones. The great metal doors of the wing clanged to and were locked for the night. Soon Cliff was alone, except for the watchers at their weapons scattered about him. Hours passed. The moon came out. From time to time, Cliff reported to the studio crew that all was quiet. His unaided eyes could now see nothing of Newt but the 2 faint red points of his eyes, but through the magnifier he stood out as clear as if in daylight, from an apparent distance of only 10 feet. Except for his eyes, there was no evidence that he was anything but dead and unfunctionable metal. Another hour passed. Now and again Cliff thumbed the levels of his tiny radio-television watch, only a few seconds at a time because of its limited battery. The air was full of Newt and his own face and his own name. and once the tiny screen showed the tree in which he was then sitting, even minutely himself. Powerful infrared long-distance television pickups were even then focused on him from nearby points of vantage. It gave him a funny feeling. Then suddenly Cliff saw something and quickly bent his eye to the viewing magnifier. Newt's eyes were moving, at least the intensity of light emanating from them varied. It was as if two tiny red flashlights were turned from side to side, their beams at each motion crossing Cliff's eyes. Thrilling, Cliff signaled the studios, cut in his pickups, and described the phenomenon. Millions resonated to the excitement in his voice. Could Newt conceivably break out of that terrible prison? Minutes flashed. The eyes looked, but Cliff could discern no movement or attempted movement of the robot's body. In brief snatches, he described what he saw. Newt was clearly alive. There could be no doubt he was straining against the transparent prison in which he had at last been locked fast. But unless he could crack it, no motion would show. Cliff took his eye from the magnifier and started. His unaided eye, looking at Newt, shrouded in darkness, saw an astonishing thing, not yet visible through his instrument. A faint red glow was spreading over the robot's body. With trembling eyes, he readjusted the lens of the television eye, but even as he did so, the glow grew in intensity. It looked as if Newt's body was being heated to incandescence. He described it in excited fragments, for it took most of his attention to keep correcting the lens. Newt passed from a figure of dull red to one brighter and brighter, clearly glowing now even through the magnifier. And then he moved. Unmistakably, he moved. He had within himself somehow the means to raise his own body temperature and was exploiting the one limitation of the plastic in which he was locked. For glass text, Cliff now remembered, was a thermoplastic material, one that set by cooling and conversely would soften again with heat. Newt was melting his way out. In 3 word snatches, Cliff described this. The robot became cherry red. The sharp edges of the ice-like block rounded, and the whole structure began to sag. The process accelerated. The robot's body moved more widely. The plastic lowered to the crown of his head, then to his neck, then his waist, which as far as Cliff could see, his body was free. And then, still cherry red, he moved forward out of sight. Cliff strained eyes and ears, but caught nothing but the distant roar of the watchers beyond the police lines, and a few low, sharp commands from the batteries posted around him. They too had heard and perhaps seen by telescreen and were waiting. Several minutes passed. There was a sharp, ringing crack. The great metal doors of the wing flew open, and out stepped the metal giant, glowing no longer. He stood stock still, and his red eyes pierced from side to side through the darkness. Voices out in the dark barked orders. In a twinkling, Newt was bathed in a narrow crisscrossing rays of sizzling colored light. Behind him the metal doors began to melt, but his great green body showed no change at all. Then the world seemed to come to an end. There was a deafening roar, and everything before Cliff seemed to explode in smoke and chaos. His tree whipped to one side so that he was nearly thrown out. Pieces of debris rained down. The tank gun had spoken, and Newt, he was sure, had been hit. Cliff held on tight and peered into the haze. As it cleared, he made out a stirring among the debris at the door, and then dimly but unmistakably he saw the great form of Newt rise to his feet. He got up slowly, turned toward the tank, and suddenly darted towards it in a wide arc. The big gun swung in an attempt to cover him, but the robot sidestepped and then was upon it. As the crew scattered, he destroyed its breech with one blow of his fist, and then he turned and looked right at Cliff. He moved toward him, and in a moment was under the tree. Cliff climbed higher. Newt put his 2 arms around the tree and gave a lifting push, and the tree tore out at the roots and fell crashing to its side. Before Cliff could scramble away, the robot had lifted him in his metal hands. Cliff thought his time had come, but strange things were yet in store for him that night. Newt did not hurt him. He looked at him from arm's length for a moment, then lifted him to a sitting position on his shoulders, legs straddling his neck. Then, holding one ankle, he turned and without hesitation started down the path which led westward away from the building. Cliff rode helpless. Out over the lawns he saw the muzzles of the scattered field pieces move as he moved. Newt and himself, their one focus. But they did not fire. Newt, by placing him on his shoulders, had secured himself against that, Cliff hoped. The robot bore straight towards the tidal basin. Most of the field pieces throbbed slowly after. Far back, Cliff saw a dark tide of confusion roll into the cleared area. The police lines had broken. Ahead, the ring thinned rapidly off to the sides. Then, from all directions but the front, the tide rolled in until individual shouts and cries could be made out. It came to a stop about 50 yards off, and a few people ventured near. Newt paid them no attention, and he no more noticed his burden than he might a fly. His neck and shoulders made Cliff a seat hard as steel, but with a deference that their underlying muscles with each movement flexed, just as would those of a human being. To Cliff, this metal musculature became a vivid wonder. Straight as the flight of a bee, over paths, across lawns, and through thin rows of trees, Newt bore the young man, the roar of thousands of people following close. Above, drone copters and darting planes, among them police cars with their nerve-shattering sirens. Just ahead lay the still waters of the tidal basin, and in its midst the simple marble tomb of the slain ambassador, Klaatu, gleaming black and cold in the light of the dozen searchlights always trained on it at night. Was this a rendezvous with the dead? Without an instant's hesitation, Newt strode down the bank and entered the water. It rose to his knees and waist until Cliff's feet were under. Straight through the dark waters for the tomb of Klaatu the robot made his inevitable way. The dark square mass of gleaming marble rose higher as they neared it. Newt's body began emerging from the water as the bottom shelved upward, until his dripping feet took the first of the rising pyramid of steps. In a moment they were at the top, on the narrow platform in the middle of which rested the simple oblong tomb. Stark in the blinding searchlights, the giant robot walked once around it, then bending, he braced himself and gave a mighty push against the top. The marble cracked, the thick cover slipped askew and broke with a loud noise on the far side. Newt went to his knees and looked within, bringing Cliff well up over the edge. Inside, in sharp shadow against the converging light beams, lay a transparent plastic coffin, thick-walled and sealed against the centuries, and containing all that was mortal of Klaatu, unspoken visitor from the great unknown. He lay as if asleep, on his face the look of godlike nobility that had caused some of the ignorant to believe him divine. He wore the robe he had arrived in. There were no faded flowers, no jewelry, no ornaments. They would have seemed profane. At the foot of the coffin lay the small sealed box, also of transparent plastic, which contained all of Earth's records of his visit, a description of the events attending his arrival, pictures of Newt and the traveler, and the little roll of sight and sound film which had caught for all time his few brief motions and words. Cliff sat very still, wishing he could see the face of the robot. Newt, too, did not move from his position of reverent contemplation, not for a long time. There on the brilliantly lighted pyramid, under the eyes of a fearful and tumultuous multitude, Newt paid final respect to his beautiful and adored master. Suddenly, then, it was over. Newt reached down and took the little box of records, rose to his feet, and started down the steps. Back through the water, straight back to the building, across lawns and paths as before, he made his irresistible way. Before him, the chaotic ring of people melted away. Behind, they followed as close as they dared, trampling each other in their effort to keep him in sight. There are no television records of his return. Every pickup was damaged on the way to the tomb. As they drew near the building, Cliff saw that the tank's projectile had made a hole 20 feet wide, extending from the roof of the ground. The door still stood open, and Newt, hardly varying his almost jerkless rhythm, made his way over the debris and went straight for the port end of the ship. Cliff wondered if he would be set free. He was. The robot set him down and pointed toward the door. Then turning, he made the sounds that opened the ship. The ramp slid down and he entered. Then Cliff did the mad, courageous thing which made him famous for a generation. Just as the ramp started sliding back in, he skipped over it and entered into the ship. The port closed. Part 7. It was pitch dark and the silence was absolute. Cliff did not move. He felt that Newt was close just ahead, and it was so. His hard metal hand took him by the waist, pulled him against his cold side, and carried him somewhere ahead. Hidden lamps suddenly bathed his surroundings with bluish light. He set Cliff down and stood looking at him. The young man already regretted his rash action, but the robot, except for his always unfathomable eyes, did not seem angry. He pointed to a stool in one corner of the room. Cliff quickly obeyed this time and sat meekly for a while, not even venturing to look around. He saw he was in a small laboratory of some kind. Complicated metal and plastic apparatus lined the walls and filled several small tables. He could not recognize or guess the function of a single piece. Dominating the center of the room was a long metal table on whose top lay a large box, much like a coffin on the outside, connected by many wires to a complicated apparatus at the far end. From close above spread a cone of light from a many-tubed lamp. One thing half covered on a nearby table did look familiar and very much out of place. From where he sat it seemed to be a briefcase, an ordinary Earthman's briefcase. He wondered. Newt paid him no attention, but at once, with the narrow edge of a thick tool, sliced the lid off the little box of records. He lifted out the strip of sight and sound film and spent fully half an hour adjusting it within the apparatus at the end of the big table. Cliff watched fascinated, wondering at the skill with which the robot used his tough metal fingers. This done, Newt worked for a long time over some accessory apparatus on an adjoining table. Then he paused thoughtfully a moment and pushed inward a long rod. A voice came out of the coffin-like box, the voice of the slain ambassador. "I am Klaatu," it said, "and this is Newt." From the recording flashed through Cliff's mind the first and only words the ambassador had spoken. But then, in the very next second, he saw that it was not so. There was a man in the box. The man stirred and sat up, and Cliff saw the living face of Klaatu. Klaatu appeared somewhat surprised and spoke quickly in an unknown tongue to Newt, and Newt, for the first time in Cliff's experience, spoke himself in answer. The robot's syllables tumbled out as if born of human emotion, and the expression on Klaatu's face changed from surprise to wonder. They talked for several minutes. Klaatu, apparently fatigued, then began to lie down, but stopped midway, for he saw Cliff. Newt spoke again at length. Klaatu beckoned Cliff with his hand, and he went to him. "Newt has told me everything," he said in a low, gentle voice, then looked at Cliff for a moment in silence, on his face a faint, tired smile. Cliff had 100 questions to ask, but for a moment hardly dared open his mouth. "But you," he began at last, very respectfully, but with an escaping excitement, "you are not the Klaatu that was in the tomb?" The man's smile faded, and he shook his head. "No." He turned to the towering Newt and said something in his own tongue, and at his words the metal features of the robot twisted as if with pain. Then he turned back to Cliff. "I am dying," he announced simply, as if repeating his words for the Earthman. Again to his face came the faint, tired smile. Cliff's tongue was locked. He just stared, hoping for light. Klaatu seemed to read his mind. "I see you don't understand," he said. "Although unlike us, Newt has great powers. When the wing was built and the lectures began, there came to him a striking inspiration. Acting on it at once, in the night, he assembled this apparatus. And now he has made me again from my voice, as recorded by your people. As you know, a given body makes a characteristic sound. He constructed an apparatus which reversed the recording process, and from the given sound made the characteristic body." Cliff gasped. "So that was it." "But you needn't die," Cliff exclaimed suddenly, eagerly. "Your voice recording was taken when you stepped out of the ship, while you were well. You must let me take you to a hospital. Our doctors are very skillful." Hardly perceptibly, Klaatu shook his head. "You still don't understand," he said slowly and more faintly. "Your recording had imperfections, perhaps very slight ones, but they doomed the product. All of Newt's experiments died in a few minutes, he tells me. And so must I." Suddenly then, Cliff understood the origin of the experiments. He remembered that on the day the wing was opened, a Smithsonian official had lost a briefcase containing film strips recording the speech of various world fauna. There on that table was a briefcase, and the still wells must have been made from strips kept in the table drawer. But his heart was heavy. He did not want this stranger to die. Slowly there dawned on him an important idea. He explained it with growing excitement. You say the recording was imperfect, and of course it was. But the cause of that lay in the use of an imperfect recording apparatus. So, if Newt, in his reversal of the process, had used exactly the same pieces of apparatus that your voice was recorded with, the imperfections could be studied, cancelled out, and you'd live and not die. As the last words left his lips, Newt whipped around like a cat and gripped him tight. A truly human excitement was shining in the metal muscles of his face. "Get me that apparatus," he ordered, in clear and perfect English. He started pushing Cliff towards the door, but Klaatu raised his hand. "There is no hurry," Klaatu said gently. "It's too late for me." "What is your name, young man?" Cliff told him. "Stay with me to the end?" he asked. Klaatu closed his eyes and rested. Then, smiling just a little, but not opening his eyes, he added, "And don't be sad, for I shall now perhaps live again, and it will be due to you. There is no pain." His voice was rapidly growing weaker. Cliff, for all the questions he had, could only look on, dumb. Again Klaatu seemed to be aware of his thoughts. "I know," he said feebly. "I know. We have so much to ask each other. About your civilization and Newt's." "And yours," said Cliff. "And Newt's," said the gentle voice again. "Perhaps some day, perhaps I will be back." He lay without moving. He lay so for a long time, and at last Cliff knew he was dead. Tears came to his eyes. In only these few minutes he had come to love this man. He looked at Newt. The robot knew too that he was dead, but no tears filled his red-lighted eyes. They were fixed on Cliff. For once the young man knew what was in his mind. "Newt," he announced earnestly, as if taking a sacred oath, "I'll get the original apparatus. I'll get it. Every piece of it. The exact same things." Without a word, Newt conducted him to the port. He made the sounds and unlocked it. As it opened, a noisy crowd of Earthmen outside trampled each other in a sudden scramble to get out of the building. The wing was lighted. Cliff stepped down the ramp. The next 2 hours, always in Cliff's memory, had a dreamlike quality. It was as if that mysterious laboratory with the peacefully sleeping dead man was the real and central part of his life, and his scene with the noisy men with whom he talked a gross and barbaric interlude. He stood not far from the ramp. He told only part of his story. He was believed. He waited quietly while all the pressure which the highest official in the land could exert was directed toward obtaining for him the apparatus the robot had demanded. When it arrived, he carried it to the floor of the little vestibule behind the port. Newt was there, as if waiting. In his arms he held the slender body of the second Klaatu. Tenderly he passed him out to Cliff, who took him without a word, as if all this had been arranged. It seemed to be the parting. Of all the things Cliff had wanted to say to Klaatu, one remained imperatively present in his mind. Now, as the green metal robot stood framed in the great green ship, he seized his chance. "Newt," he said, earnestly, holding carefully the limp body in his arms, "you must do one thing for me. Listen carefully. I want you to tell your master, the master yet to come, that what happened to the first Klaatu was an accident for which all Earth is immeasurably sorry. Will you do that?" "I have known it," the robot answered gently. "But will you promise to tell your master just those words as soon as he has arrived?" "You misunderstand," said Newt, still gently and quietly spoken. 4 more words. As Cliff heard them, a mist passed over his eyes, and his body went numb. As he recovered and his eyes came back to focus, he saw the great ship disappear. It just suddenly was not there anymore. He fell back a step or two. In his ears, like great bells, rang Newt's last words. Never, never was he to disclose them till the day he came to die. "You misunderstand," the mighty robot had said. "I am the master."